Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about the election of 1948. And Chris, I think what struck me about this particular election is not only how things went in a completely different direction than a lot of people were thinking it was going into the election, but also just the number of people running for president at that year, and of course, just the massive divide in the Democratic Party.
Well, and I think we also have to keep in mind the events that lead up to the election of 1948. I mean, there has been a president that had been in charge for the longest in the manner of history, so much so that they would install an amendment to make sure that something like that never happened. But you have this, this hero status in Franklin Roosevelt, and people, whether people loved him or hated him, the fact was he had guided America through 12 years of war and peace. And, he had charm and his oratorical skills and just his shrewd political ability. When the next person is to come along, it's going to be an interesting election, no matter who that is. And it just happened to be Harry Truman, who, basically is one of those presidents that maybe just falls into being president. So it's a pretty interesting election. As you mentioned, it's very controversial, just in the Democratic Party, but also in how Dewey, who's the guy we're going to talk about also, how he actually loses something that he really should have won.
Yeah, and talking about Franklin Roosevelt, he had served, as you said, 12 years. That's 3 terms. He had been elected to a 4th term, totally unprecedented in American history. I mean, no other president had served more than 2 terms before Franklin Roosevelt and after Franklin Roosevelt. Nobody served more than 2 terms. And Roosevelt not only runs 4 times, he wins 4 times. And on his 4th term, he actually serves, the way I calculated it, Chris, it seemed a little less than 3 months. Now, he was inaugurated on January 20, 1945, and he dies in, I think it was April 1945, April 12, 1945. So he only, in his 4th term, he only served a few short months. I guess probably the 2nd shortest presidency in American history, with the shortest presidency going to William Henry Harrison, who died just 30 days after becoming president. He, of course, was a Whig. Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat. So this is a very interesting election in 1948. Truman has been president now for basically 4 years. He's essentially, for all intents and purposes, served a 4-year term. He's a Democrat, just like Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat. And he's coming into the election of 1948, having really, like is often the case with sitting presidents, got hammered in the midterm elections of 1946, where Republicans took control both of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And of course, that's going to make it more difficult for Truman to get his agenda pushed through. But he does a number of things that sort of elevates himself above that situation to try to, I guess, get some steam rolling.
And I don't think there's anybody who would say that they didn't necessarily like Harry Truman. They just thought he was just someone who was maybe not fit for the presidency. I mean, the high office. He didn't instill high confidence. He didn't bring about admiration. And even Truman himself had said that he never really aspired to be president. He would have been happy just being, a United States senator. And, what happens is he's the vice president to Franklin Roosevelt. And so when Franklin Roosevelt dies, Truman comes on board. But what happens leading up to the campaign of 1948 is that Franklin's people, these, I guess you would call them New Dealers, if you will, they start causing Truman trouble, because there's a lot of those individuals, as well as some others, who want to draft Eisenhower, who was the leader of, D-Day and Normandy and all of those things. And they saw this man as a general compared to a plain spoken Harry Truman. But then you also have those Dixiecrats and the progressives, as you're going to talk about with those other candidates that come in. So when you would walk into a 1948 presidential election, you would think that the majority of the Democratic Party would support the vice president, or at least, he'd have a pretty good following. But with Truman, their attitudes, whether it's intentional or it's not intentional, basically he falls apart long before he has to run against Dewey.
Yeah, Roosevelt, I find it was interesting that you mentioned that he wasn't necessarily the most popular president going into the 1948 election. One opinion poll had him about 35% approval rating. That is about I don't know if it's as bad as you could get, but it is not good when you're going into a presidential election. So going into 1948, he does a number of things to try to help himself with that base you're talking about. So, for example, he vetoes the Taft-Hartley bill, which would have put restrictions on labor unions. He comes out in favor of civil rights, which we'll talk about a little later. And he embraces a number of the type of programs that Roosevelt had embraced, things like higher minimum wage, federal housing, and things like that. He's also comes out as, anti-Soviet. And in 1948, May of 1948, of course, going into once the election of 1948 is picking up, he is the president that actually recognizes the state of Israel, of course, endearing himself to the Jewish population in the United States. So as a president, he maybe wasn't the most popular president. He comes into 1948 not looking that good, but he starts working to try to improve his status with people. And then, of course, the Democratic Party just completely splits up. It splits three ways. You have Harry Truman, who is going to be nominated by the larger party itself. But then you've got a guy called Henry Wallace, who had been Secretary of Commerce under Harry Truman, who comes out and runs for president on the Progressive Party ticket. And he gives speeches in which he's critical of the policy that Truman has enacted toward the Soviet Union and that kind of thing. And then, Chris, the one that everybody's most interested in maybe is the Dixiecrats.
Yeah, with Strom Thurmond. And basically, that comes about because Truman actually takes a very strong stand on civil rights. And because he is so strong about wanting to ensure that all people receive specific rights that are due to them by being a citizen of the United States, you get these individuals down south that just can't stand that. And, Truman, he has a lot going for him and he has a lot going against him. But one of the things that you just can't fault is the fact that he has lived under the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt. And I don't know, Ray, if there's any candidate that would have ran for this party to run for president in 1948 really was going to have a chance, just because everybody expected FDR version 2, if you will, because they had lived under him for 12 years. They had seen all of these things that he had done. And, you think about Truman was really kind of in the dark with a lot of things. That's a whole nother topic when it comes to World War II in general. But I just think that Truman or Wallace or, any of these individuals, it was just going to be difficult on their own to try to become president, much less having to go against a pretty cocky individual on the other side.
Yeah, the Democrat Party had divided itself. You had the Progressive Party candidate with Henry Wallace. You had the Dixiecrats, like you said, with South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond. And then you had others. You had a guy called Norman Thomas, who was a Socialist Party candidate, and a guy called Claude Watson, who was the Prohibition party candidate. So you had a lot of people running for president. You mentioned a few minutes ago, Chris, and I wanted to come back to it, about things that Harry Truman did really the lead up to the election of 1948, where he really came down hard on civil rights. He issued several executive orders. Among them were executive orders to desegregate the military and also to end discrimination in civil service jobs. So he does take very proactive stances in favor of civil rights, which of course these Southern Democrats who are going to go to the Dixiecrat party, who are going to push for Strom Thurmond, who are still trying to disenfranchise African-American voters and keep them away from voting as much as they can. They're not going to like that. And that's what pushes them out of the party.
Yeah. And I mean, even Truman, when he finds out that the Dixiecrats are going to kind of revolt and go into their own party, Truman is told, listen, here's what you need to do. You give your priority to the farmers. You focus on the labor groups. You take care of the individuals affected by the civil rights that you're doing. Court the common people because you can identify with them. And even if Henry Wallace runs on a third party ticket, I think you still have a pretty good chance of getting in. But the reality is that, yes, he takes a stand and he does a lot of these things. But what happens is that he doesn't really give it his all, I guess. And the other fact is there was, I think, some research done. I don't even remember when it was done, but it was around 1946 or 1947. And the survey still came back that Truman was just ineffective, I think, because the common person was looking at FDR and Truman. The other thing is there's so much divisiveness in the Democratic Party. And when you do not have a cohesive unit, that's going to lead to trouble. And in 1948, people just thought that the chance of a Democrat being elected to the presidency was just virtually not going to happen. So all of those things are adding up to a very difficult campaign for Truman.
Yeah, and Truman, understanding that, no doubt, he trying to sort of take the hard line. He threatens to call back Congress, which is controlled by Republicans, and he does. And he calls them back to Washington, D.C. They stay there for about 2 weeks and do absolutely nothing. So he sort of uses that to try to prove his point. So we've talked a little bit about the Democrats. Let's move over to the Republicans. Thomas Dewey.
Yeah, and when you think about Dewey, I mean, he is, I don't know the word. I guess you could say conceited, cocky, very cold personality. And the people that he was really against, which is not good if you want to be a politician, is he was extremely impatient with reporters. And he would try to use them for his own benefit instead of trying to get them on his side, if you will. And, what happens is newspapers begin to use every opportunity they have to say that this guy is conceited, that he's superficial. And basically, they even in agreement say he's not qualified to become president of the United States, even though he had served, many different levels of in politics. And, even I think it was one news, I forget who it was that said it. I think it was from the New York Times that basically just said, we just don't like Dewey. He's a cold fish.
Yeah, I think one person referred to him as icy. Mm-hmm. They said he had the personality of the little man that sits on top of the wedding cake. In some ways, I know I'm sort of bringing a more modern twist to this. Sounds like they're talking about Al Gore. If you remember back Al Gore in 2000, that he was very stiff, very rigid.
But he was one of the most successful prosecutors in New York history, and he was a successful governor. I mean, they talk about that when he was governor, which I think he was governor for 3 years, from 1943 to 1945. Mm-hmm. That he was really just helping build up New York. I mean, it was seeing growth like it had never seen. And he was reelected as governor in 1946 by a whopping 650,000 people. So, I mean, he was a forceful, quick, inquisitive guy that people in New York really respected and they appreciated. The problem is, can you take that success as a prosecutor and as a governor? Can you take that to the next level? And he had already tried in 1944 going up against Franklin Roosevelt, but really nobody was going to have a chance and with that one. But you now have Franklin Roosevelt out of the picture. You have Truman, who basically is just really not the character that Roosevelt was. Is just kind of stepping into all kinds of mud holes. And so Dewey really has a chance now, where Roosevelt was brilliant, Truman is average. And here comes Dewey, who says, look at my record. I can be productive.
Yeah, and Dewey hadn't done that bad against Roosevelt in 44. He
Right.
done all right. So I guess, looking at Truman, who was, I guess you could say, the B team, he looked at 48 as an opportunity maybe to move in. But I always feel sorry for these type of figures, the Truman figures in American history. Here he is. He's been president for 4 years following Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president for over 12 years. Roosevelt, was very effective in World War II. Whatever you think about the Great Depression, whether his New Deal programs pulled America out of the Great Depression or not, he handled that well with his radio fireside chats, his World War II leadership. And then you come and he dies, and Truman is put in a situation where you're trying to, I guess you could say, fill the footsteps of a giant. And I think you see this at several times in American history. Poor John Adams following George Washington. I mean, right. Nobody wants to be John Adams following George Washington, or George H.W. Bush following Ronald Reagan. Who wants to be the man following Ronald Reagan? I mean, so these type of situations, it can be very unfair, I guess you could say, to the person who follows, because they're trying to fulfill a role. They're trying to fill shoes that they really don't have much chance to fill.
Well, and now, so absolutely. But then you also add into this part about a third party that is now coming in. You have a progressive party, and the progressives who are going to support Henry Wallace are Democrats. So that Truman is going to lose a significant amount of voters just because Henry Wallace is deciding to run for president of the United States. And Ray, what we do know is that anytime there's a third party, it is going to hurt one of the candidates. And in this case, all of those progressives are leaving the Democratic Party, and they're going to be joining Henry Wallace and his gang. And this poses a serious threat to Truman's reelection, because basically here you have Wallace, who is saying nobody likes the old tired Democratic Party and the hopeless Republican Party, and you don't want any of those people who same old. You want me. And so he appeals to these disillusioned individuals, and that pretty much causes Truman to be very frightful because the poll numbers are not looking good, especially in states such as New York, Illinois, and especially in the big state of California.
Yeah, and also the Dixiecrats in the South.
Yeah.
The Democrats throughout the early and the mid 20th century are very strong in the South. They have that Southern bloc. And if you actually look at the electoral map after Election Day, and we'll come back to this, Thurman gains electoral college votes out of the South. So Truman is not just simply dealing with one third party, he's dealing with two third parties that has the real potential of pulling this election from him. So,
And Ray, just one other thing that goes with that. The nation wasn't that excited about Truman's stance on civil rights. So, he's making a big push for this, but the ones who are really big on these civil rights are not in his favor either. And so he has just got it coming at all these different areas. And so I think you do have to feel sorry for him, because he's found himself in just a difficult situation.
Yeah, and so we get to the campaign, loving the campaigns, right? And Harry Truman decides to do something a little different, not necessarily the first time anybody did this, I don't think, but he does it bigger than anybody had done it before, and that is a whistle-stop tour, several whistle-stop tours. And he starts this with a speech on Labor Day in Detroit, Michigan, to a labor union group. And that's sort of his kickoff for his 1948 campaign. And he goes on this whistle stop tour. Chris, think about this. I mean, have you ever ridden on a train?
Yeah, I have ridden on a train, but I didn't have the opportunity to go very far. I think it was, I'm trying to remember. I think I paid 25 cents and it just went back and forth. It was on the front there at Walmart, I think.
Well, I mean, it's a train trip, you know. Don't feel bad about your lack of rail experience. I've been on Amtrak. I've been from Raleigh, North Carolina to Tampa and back. And you know, well, let's just simply say it's a certain type of travel. You have to get used to some things. Harry Truman traveled over 8,000 miles throughout these whistle stop tours, and gave over 300 political speeches, campaign speeches at these whistle stop tours, or the stops along this whistle stop tour. I mean, this man put the pedal to the metal when it came to campaigning. He went out there, he kissed babies, he shook hands, he talked to people, he got up close and personal with the American people. And Chris, you gotta think that is going to help him out.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to think about it. Once again, this whistle stop is meeting the needs and attending to the common man, right? And he's kind of echoing the traditions. I remember, I think when Abraham Lincoln had died and they were transporting his body back to Illinois, that they stopped like at all of these places, and the crowd just came to every station just to get a glimpse, you know, of that president. And so I think here, you know, you have this campaign stop, this whistle stop, where it's not in some big convention hall. It's not all these big wigs that are standing up giving these, you know, speeches that amount to nothing, but it's just a simple man on the back of a train who takes a few moments and says, hey, we're here to just take a moment and say, this is why I'm running. And I think that was a huge advantage for him, and basically will set the precedent for the campaigning that he does a little later in the campaign. I think that was called the Give 'em Hell campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you compare his campaign style, you know, going out there giving them hell type of thing, to Dewey. Dewey was concerned that he had come across a little too harsh in 44. So he sort of pulls it back in 48. And he came across, according to reports I've read, he came across as sort of bland. Again, I just have to keep going back, and I'm sorry if I upset anybody here, to Al Gore in 2000. This very stiff, this very, you know, this very stiff, this very rigid type of personality. And then you've got on the other side of the track over there, you've got Harry Truman, who's just barnstorming the country on this whistle stop tours, and is just out there shaking hands and making effective speeches.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, Dewey thought, he's looking at these things called polls.
Yeah.
And you know, as he's reading the polls, I mean, all of these things that we've talked about, there's discord in the Democratic Party. There's a third candidate that's going to come out of this. Not everybody supports Truman's civil rights. And Dewey kind of sees himself as, all right, what I need to do is not do anything that screws up what I'm about to accomplish. I'm going to be president. We're going to win. I'm pretty confident, as long as I don't open my mouth and say something that I regret. So that's why he basically didn't say anything. You know, he didn't want to create a stir. He was like, I've got this in the bag, so I'm just going to go out, say hello to people. I'll do the typical stuff, but I'm not going to start things, you know, that could create, I guess, basically rock the boat, if you will. That's why he said nothing controversial.
Yeah, he wanted to play it safe. I mean, there was a poll in October that showed him at about 50% to Truman around 44%. I mean,
Yeah.
he was thinking, I'm going to play it safe.
And we also need to say now, I mean, Dewey also traveled. He did about 16,000 miles of campaigning also, but his speech was the same no matter where he was. And all he was trying to say is, we are going to be united. We're going to be united. We will wage peace. We're not going to go to war. We're going to support people. We're going to love. I mean, all of this just flowing, lovely message that basically means nothing. It doesn't talk about how you're going to do things. I mean, there's no plan, right? I mean, there's no platform. I mean, basically, it's just, you got Truman that says, give them hell, and you got Dewey that says, give them unity. And that's the big difference between the two.
And just like today, give them hell sells better than give them unity.
Absolutely. For some reason, that's what people are all interested in, right?
Especially today. So election day comes around, November 2, 1945. Election day comes around. You've got to think Thomas Dewey thinks he has this in the bag. He's got to be feeling comfortable. Harry Truman goes home to Missouri, where he goes to bed, thinking that he's losing. At the time he goes to bed, he was ahead my understanding at the time Truman went to bed, he was ahead in the poll or ahead in the returns, but he still was being predicted to lose. The media and the pundits were still saying Dewey was going to win. And then in the early morning hours, some Secret Service agents came in the room and woke him up, and he was ahead by over 2 million votes and ended up winning the election. So it was, for Dewey, this had to have been a surprise outcome. And it was a surprise outcome for a lot of people, apparently even in the media, because 2 days after the election, he is handed a copy of the Chicago Tribune with the headline, Dewey defeats Truman. So the media was not only planning for Dewey to win, they had already printed the copy.
Yeah, I mean, they had already printed the copy, and basically everybody just knew. And so instead of basically, Dewey defeats Truman, it really should have been Dewey defeats Dewey. I mean, that was the thing. I mean, he snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, as one person famously said. I mean, it was in the bag for him, but because he failed to really go out there and work hard to demonstrate why he should be president, because he was a lethargic campaigner, he basically ignored, the major issues that were out there. He loses. And not only does he lose, but all of the media, the newspapers, all of these pollings, I mean, they basically have egg on their face too, because in this rush to judgment, in this rush to be number one, they realize they've made a grave mistake, which is something, Ray, that you mentioned Al Gore. You would have thought that the media would have learned from their mistakes in 1948. But as we saw in the election of 2000, which we've done a podcast on, they didn't learn from their own mistakes.
And they made the same mistake again in 2016.
Exactly.
Predictions were basically that Hillary Clinton had this in the bag. And I remember in 2016 going into a local restaurant where they had a TV playing, and it was early in the evening, and you could tell very early in the evening things weren't going the way the media had thought they were going to go. So the media did not learn its lesson in 48. The media did not learn its lesson over and over again. And I suspect, Chris, in 2024, they'll show they still haven't learned the lesson about being careful about these type of things.
Yeah. And I think there's something else with this also, that you've got to work hard to be president, but you also have to manage how you do it. I found it interesting in doing the research for this that, I mean, Dewey doesn't lose by a lot, I mean, it's not a lot at all. And if Dewey would have spent a little more time in Ohio and only gotten 3,000 more votes, he would have won Ohio. He would have won Illinois with 16,000 votes. But California, if he would have just gotten out there and another 9,000 votes, he would have won that also. So with just a little bit more attention to detail, and if he would have spent a little more effort on the African-American vote, he would have been president of the United States, and the Chicago Tribune would have got it right.
Yeah, and the Electoral College outcome sort of doesn't demonstrate how close the election really was,
Right.
because, Henry Wallace, the progressive candidate, he does win almost 1.5 million votes, but he doesn't get any Electoral College votes. So the Electoral College is divided between Harry Truman, Thomas Dewey, and Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond pulls 39 Electoral College votes. South Carolina, he gets all 8 votes from South Carolina, 11 votes from Alabama, 9 votes from Mississippi, 10 votes from Louisiana. And very interesting, there was one elector, I guess what you would refer to as a faithless elector in the state of Tennessee, who instead of voting for Truman, voted for Strom Thurmond. So he got 1 vote out of 12 from the state of Tennessee. So Truman comes in first with 303 Electoral College votes, Dewey 189. But when you look at the popular vote, it is very close. In fact, Chris, Harry Truman won less than 50% of the popular vote.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to show that you have to pay attention to all aspects of the polling and of the voting to really get a good feel of how elections go. You can't just say, oh, Truman won. There's so much more into it, as we've seen through this podcast.
Yeah, that's why I love studying presidential elections.
Yeah.
I just find them, some people say, well, there's only been a certain number of presidential elections in American history. But the thing about it is every single one of them is a book within itself. I mean, they're all just these fascinating things. You think about what leads up to them, what happens during the election, the outcome, and all of that kind of stuff. So Truman wins the presidency, his second term in 1948. And of course, he's going to be inaugurated in 1949 to serve his second term. Chris, I really enjoyed discussing the election of 1948.
Yeah, I guess the train has left the station. I really appreciate it. It was great.
I was waiting for it. I was ready. Okay. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your family and friends. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Google Podcasts. Basically, anywhere you listen to podcasts, we're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. You can email us. We love getting emails from our listeners. historyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.